Dr. Jacob Gardner, thanks so much for coming on to evolutionsoup all the way from your office in Reading, Berkshire, right here in the UK. You are an evolutionary biologist as well as a Post-doctoral Research Associate at the University of Reading, using the fossil record, ancient human DNA, and advanced statistical modeling to explore how species evolve, disperse, and adapt to climate change. Just recently, you and your colleagues published a paper which challenges the long-accepted idea that our ancestors grew steadily larger and heavier over time, and that, in fact, many factors contributed to changes in body size, resulting in the human population that we see today. Welcome to the show, Jacob. Well, you've just finished your postdoc and will be starting a fellowship in the University of Reading in September. Very exciting times for you, and hopefully the paper has been well received by the scientific community.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm a longtime listener and fan of the show and excited to finally share our findings with everyone. The paper's had some nice press coverage so far, and I've been interviewed and quoted in newspapers from multiple different countries, including a possible article with New Scientist. So yeah, exciting times indeed.
Before we dive into your fascinating research, let's just hear a little bit about your background. Jacob, where did you grow up, and what were the influences and fascinations that led you to where you are now?
Sure. I grew up in California, first in Sacramento, in the middle of California, and then in San Luis Obispo, which is north of Los Angeles. And I've had an interest in paleontology and fossils for really as long as I could remember. My passion and love for paleontology and fossils definitely stemmed from childhood toys that I would receive as gifts and media. I was a 90s baby, so I grew up loving and watching Jurassic Park, which was a huge influence on me, as well as many paleontologists, young paleontologists today. I was probably about 5 years old or younger when I first watched Jurassic Park, and it scared the crap out of me. But I was completely hooked on dinosaurs. As I got older, this developed into an interest in paleontology more as a science. I was very lucky that my parents and family did everything they could to nurture my passions and interests, buying me nature and paleontology documentaries such as Walking with Dinosaurs and copies of Scientific American. I was particularly fascinated with how new technologies were being used to tell us a lot more about extinct animals, like new microscope techniques to determine the colors of dinosaur feathers, and new tools from engineering to estimate how hard T-Rexes could bite. And this really made me realize that this was a growing field, something that that I could get into seriously as a profession and as a career. My science teachers in high school really encouraged me to pursue paleontology as a career. So when it came time to look into which universities to go to, I looked into what are the best universities to study paleontology, and I found that Montana State University in Bozeman, Montana, was one of the best places specifically for dinosaur paleontology. And going to Montana State was probably one of the best decisions of my life. I would definitely not be here where I am today without the incredible opportunities given to me as an undergraduate there. There's just way too many cool experiences to tell you about, but one in particular was when I was in second year, my undergraduate, and I got to actually dig up dinosaurs in eastern Montana with the Museum of the Rockies. I was on a crew with some of my closest friends and fellow undergraduates, like Jack Wilson, Holly Flora, Danny Anduza, and we were led by a British paleontologist and is now a paleontologist in the US and in North Dakota, Dr. Denver Fowler. And one amazing instance of this field trip was we were digging this this site where the previous year they found part of a triceratops skeleton, and we were there the following year to try to collect more of it. We had to dig a pit that was probably 3 to 4 meters tall, 4 to 5 meters wide. It took us an entire week with picks and shovels just to dig this massive pit. And at the very bottom, we had found the top of the skull of this triceratops. And you can see the two brow horns just emerging from the bottom of this pit. And at that moment, I knew that I had made the right choice going into paleontology and going to Montana State. A couple years later, and not too long later, two of my closest supervisors during my undergraduate, Dr. Chris Organ and Professor Jim Schmidt, gave me some of my first research projects as undergraduate. Montana State had a lot of funds available for undergraduates to carry out research projects. So I got to travel all around the country, helping with field work and conducting research projects on many things, from how insect and fish fossils are preserved in the fossil record. Another project that we actually published 10 years ago from this month on how features in the vertebrae or the backbone in dinosaurs allowed large dinosaurs like T-Rex to walk around on two legs despite being so large. So it was an incredible undergraduate experience, to say the least, and I became convinced that I wanted to continue doing research in paleontology. So that led me to start a PhD at Montana State with Chris Organ, specifically focusing on how extinct and living vertebrates, such as dinosaurs and mammals, adapted and evolved in response to climate change. We had a really fun paper that we published a couple of years ago, co-led by one of my good friends, Lauren Wilson, who's now a PhD student at Princeton University, where we showed that changing climates over the span of the Mesozoic era, so 252 to 66 million years ago when the dinosaurs went extinct, that wasn't a major factor in explaining how big or how small dinosaurs and mammals were at that time and across that large span of time as well. And this was interesting because it contrasted with some of the patterns that people have observed over the last century and a half on how birds and mammals are today. So some species living in colder climates tend to be bigger, like polar bears, compared to their closer relatives like brown bears and black bears, potentially as a way of generating and retaining more heat. And so this provided an interesting exception to this broader biological rule about how climate may impact the sizes of animals across the globe. And so before I finished my PhD, my supervisor, Chris Organ, and I moved to the University of Reading, where he was starting a new job. I ultimately defended and earned my PhD here and was offered a job as a postdoc or a postdoctoral researcher here at the University of Reading, and I've been here ever since.
Just recently, June 2026, you and your colleagues published research on the evolution of hominin body mass over time. Most people recall the famous but very dated March of Progress illustration from decades ago. Jacob, why did you decide to tackle this problem? And in a nutshell, What did your research conclude?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you said, there's this pervasive notion, or long been this pervasive notion, that humans evolved in a straight line from a chimpanzee like ancestor that was a bit smaller, had a smaller brain, walked on all fours on their knuckles, uh, all the way up in a chain to the ancestor of our species, where we're a bit bigger, we have larger brains, we walk upright on 2 feet, freeing the hands to craft stone tools, enabling our behavioral complexity. Part of the story is one of size, so there is no question that we are larger than an earlier hominin like australopithecus, which is Lucy's species. So on average, australopithecus would have been about 40 kilograms in weight and the height of a 7 to 9 year old child. There's this famous photo of one of the children of the leading researchers studying Lucy when Lucy was brought to the US, or at least copies of her skeleton. And it's this little girl standing next to Lucy's skeleton, and that just really illustrates how much smaller these earlier hominins were compared to our species. But how and when we got larger as a species is the ultimate question. And this is important because size, at least partly, determines so many aspects of an animal's biology and ecology. It determines how much food you need to eat, what types of food you need to eat, how far of a distance you can go to procure food, find new resources, find new habitats, and determines various aspects of our metabolism, growth, how big our babies can be, et cetera, et cetera. And even until recently, there have been multiple studies that still found support for an average size increase in hominin fossils over time. And so, what I mean by this is if you were to take all the hominin fossils that we know of and how big they are, say at 4 million years ago, when we start to see species like Ardipithecus ramidus, and we take what is the average or typical size of a hominin living at this time, 4 million years ago, we compare that to the average at 3 million years, 2 million years, 1 million years, and every single point in between leading up to our species today, Homo sapiens. And we expect, under this hypothesis, that this average would steadily increase over time. So the typical hominin that you would see at each point in time gets bigger and bigger and bigger. However, many other recent studies found that there wasn't this gradual or steady increase in size. Rather, this average or typical size of a hominin specimen jumped in size at a key point in time. Usually, the studies found that this occurred around 2 million years or so, give or take a few 100,000 years, and usually with the appearance of much larger hominin species like Homo erectus or Homo ergaster. And although these ideas aren't mutually exclusive from one another, these two hypotheses of how our ancestors got bigger compared to earlier hominins seem to be at odds in the literature. And so in this new paper, I collaborated with paleoanthropologists, Dr. Thomas Puschel and Dr. Susie White, as well as evolutionary biologists, Dr. Manabu Sakamoto and Professor Chris Venditti. And we decided to test these two hypotheses in a new way by including both possibilities in the same evolutionary model, with which we were able to quantify which of these two scenarios best explained the current data and was therefore the most meaningful in explaining how our ancestors got bigger. So, for example, if you were to line up all the fossils by just how old they are and plot how big they are through time and projected a straight line through it from 4 million years ago to today, how well does that explain the fossil record? And are there species that are bigger or smaller than we might expect given that projection? And similarly, if we were to add a point at which this line shifted upwards, say around 2 million years ago with the appearance of Homo erectus, does this projection on either side of this point basically become a flat line? So is there stasis leading up to fossils like species like Homo erectus, followed by a jump? Or is there a gradual increase, in which of these two best explain the data? And what we found, interestingly, was there's the possibility that it's a mixture of these two scenarios. So we did find support for a gradual trend of increasing size through time, but at a more modest rate. So if we go back to our averages at different time points, we found that at 4 million years ago, we would expect on average to see a hominin that's about 40 kilograms in size. And then 2 million years later, we would expect to see a hominin that was about 45 to 47 kilograms in size. So a pretty modest increase over 2 million year period. But then at the same time, we see a shift in size to almost 60 kilograms on average at around that 2 million year mark, not earlier and not later, specifically in later occurring species like Homo erectus and ergaster. And so this adds to the growing picture that hominin evolution and our story was much more complicated than previously supposed. One thing we did not account for that you may be thinking about is sexual dimorphism. So earlier hominins like Ardipithecus and some species of Australopithecus seem to be more sexually dimorphic, meaning that males in the species were larger in size and had longer canine teeth, whereas females were smaller in size and had shorter canine teeth. This is very similar to what we see in chimpanzees, gorillas, and many primates today. Maybe not to the same extent, but a similar process. And over time, looking at the fossils, it appears that this dimorphism has been reduced, especially in our lineage, our genus Homo, where males and females are a lot closer in size, and their canine teeth were much more similar in size as well.
So the crux of this study is the apparent growth spurt we see in early members of the genus Homo, particularly Homo erectus and Homo ergaster. But do we know why this growth spurt happened?
This is such a great question, and we're still not entirely sure. It's very difficult to pin down one specific factor or explanation in a pattern that we see in the data, especially in fossil data going back so many million of years ago. But this growth spurt that we see around 2 million years ago with species like Homo erectus or Homo ergaster, as well as species that lived potentially at the same time and may be distinct from earlier hominins like Homo habilis, is a species called Homo rudolfensis. And it adds to the growing idea that these species would have aided in having a larger size. They also have disproportionately longer legs compared to their arms, and both of these things are useful when you're adapted for walking across the landscape and spending less time in the trees. So the bigger you are and the longer legs you have, the further you can go to collect food, to in persistence hunting, especially in trying to hunt larger and larger animals, chasing down these animals and consuming more meat. We see potentially in species like Homo erectus, the possibility of cooking. When you cook meat, especially, and other foods, this allows you to intake more calories into your body, which would have also fueled or helped fuel this growth spurt. Alongside this, we see an increased rate in the evolution of brain size, and all of this is sort of interacting potentially in a complex way, but highlights that these species like Homo erectus or Homo ergaster, and then later the Neanderthals, Homo heidelbergensis, our species, they were adapted and using their landscapes in a different way that was unique to earlier hominins and even some of the earliest members of our genus like Homo habilis and Homo naledi, which we might talk about later. And one of the useful tools that we used for detecting this jump in size at around 2 million years ago were Bayesian phylogenetic methods.
Well, Bayesian methodology has been discussed on this channel before. It's very popular in paleoanthropology for dating fossil sites and building evolutionary family trees. So, how exactly did your team utilize this method to determine hominin body sizes?
Yeah, sure. So Bayesian methods, as you said, are a prominent tool in evolutionary biology, paleoanthropology, and even for predicting weather outcomes and election results. For evolutionary biology, it's especially useful when combining data from fossils, the physical appearance of species, and the genetic data to create family trees of species or phylogenies. So these are called Bayesian phylogenetic methods, which we used in this study. Bayesian, put more simply, is a framework for updating your initial or prior belief about a hypothesis with new evidence in order to estimate the probability that your hypothesis is true given the data that you currently have. So to be conservative, we may have some prior belief like there hasn't been any change in the size of hominin species over time. But with new evidence from the fossil record and our model of evolution, we can get an updated estimate of how much change has occurred and the probability that that amount of change had occurred given the data and the model that we used. Another neat application of Bayesian methods that is used, again, from everything from understanding the evolution and relationship of species to predicting weather and election outcomes, is its ability to incorporate lots of uncertainty about the data. As you can imagine, there is a lot of uncertainty in determining how big an extinct hominin was just from its fossils alone. We can't exactly, use a time machine to go back and weigh Lucy to see how big Lucy might have been. So in order to do this, paleoanthropologists use principles of allometry and scaling. So this is how much our bones change in size and shape with the weight of an animal. And there are some pretty well-established relationships between how big certain bones are, or how thick certain bones are, and how much an animal weighs. So many studies are dedicated to looking at different measurements. So for instance, one of the best measurements is the diameter or the size or width of the ball in the top of your femur or thigh bone. This is the ball in the ball and socket joint of your hip. And the reason that this is a useful measurement for predicting the size of an animal, living or extinct, is because especially in an animal like us that stands on two legs, this determines and controls the amount of weight that the body can support. So the size of this ball and socket joint is a very useful indicator for determining the size of an animal. But again, there's a lot of uncertainty in these measurements, and not every fossil that we find will have this really nice feature such as the ball and socket joint. Some fossil hominins are just an arm bone or just a bone in the foot or even just the skull. And so paleoanthropologists have to come up with other measurements to try to determine or estimate the weight of this extinct individual. And so to account for this uncertainty, what we did was we gathered as much information as we possibly could on all the different body mass estimates that we see in the literature. We've collected over 1,000 body mass estimates for over 380 hominin specimens of over 20 different species. And we also collected different metrics and different methods that previous studies used to estimate body mass. We also collected different ways that people have classified these hominin specimens. So the taxonomy of these specimens, which boxes or different species that different paleoanthropologists put or classified these fossils as. So one fossil of a thigh bone at a given point of time could be classified by one researcher as a Paranthropus, but another researcher could classify it as a Homo erectus, adding even more uncertainty into the bigger picture here. And so to account for this, we made 1,000 different data sets that samples the range of uncertainty for all of the different body mass estimates, as well as all the different ways that people have classified these fossils. And so across these 1,000 different data sets and different evolutionary models, we were able to sample and account for this range of uncertainty that people had on the hominin fossil record. And so this suggests to us that the trends that we see, and especially this big jump that we see around 2 million years ago, is accounting for and is in spite of all of this uncertainty that we have in the fossil record of hominins.
As anyone who follows human origin studies knows, our ancient past has gotten very messy and complicated lately. Every so often, an unexpected discovery really throws a spanner in the works. Jacob, what about the anomalies we see in the human family tree? Smaller hominins like Homo floresiensis and Homo naledi, how did they factor into your work.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, to me, one of the most exciting parts about the paper. For a while now, the past few decades or couple decades, we began finding these strange and smaller bodied and smaller brain hominins that would have lived at the same time as some of our ancestors. Homo floresiensis, just sometimes nicknamed the Hobbit, from the island of Flores in Indonesia, was found to be the small, diminutive hominin that had features more similar to our genus Homo. So it was classified in our lineage Homo, and would have lived as recently as probably 50,000 years ago. So coincided with our ancestors, Homo sapiens. And then we have Homo naledi, discovered in South Africa. Also, on average, a smaller sized hominin, possibly not as small as Homo floresiensis. But Homo naledi, also again discovered in weird circumstances in a cave, one of the largest collections of hominin fossils discovered. And more and more that we find out about these hominins are just incredibly fascinating. Homo naledi has a unique mix of features characteristic of not just our genus Homo, but also of earlier hominins like australopithecus, suggesting that Homo naledi may have had, maybe still retained some aspect of climbing in trees. We're still not really sure why it had a mixture of features. And then with Homo floresiensis, there's this idea that it was smaller in stature and size because it was isolated on an island. This is known as the island effect, where some species get smaller when they become isolated on islands, either because they don't have any large predators to contend with, or there is a lack of resources that they need to fuel the larger sizes that they could have in their ancestors. And so there's a lot to learn about these two species. Our study found, when we, like I talked about before, did this projection modeling of what we might expect if there's this increase in size among hominins through time from 4 million years ago to the present. Do we see any deviations in that pattern? We saw a deviation in 2 million years ago with Homo erectus, where they were much larger than we had expected, given this general trend. And we see the opposite in species like Homo floresiensis and Homo naledi, where they're much smaller than we might expect, given the time that they lived in. And this tells us a lot about the complexity of human evolution. Some of these lineages, although coexisting at the same time, would have been using their environments in vastly different ways. Some, like Homo floresiensis and Homo naledi, may have retained or gone back and had a lifestyle that was more based in the trees, compared to our species, which was firmly adapted for living life outside the trees and on two legs, and hunting larger and larger prey and cooking meat to fuel that growth. And so we think that these species, they sort of prove the point as being outliers. They're not just exceptions to the rule, but they are sort of proving the rule itself, that human evolution was much more complex than we previously gave it credit for. Another interesting outlier is the earliest members of our genus Homo, like Homo habilis, where despite being considered an early member of our lineage, was much smaller than we would expect given these evolutionary trends. It would have had a body size as well as body proportion, so much longer arms compared to its legs, more similar to species of australopithecus than it had in common with other members of the genus Homo. And so this adds to a growing discussion that size is not necessarily an indicator of what's considered a member of Homo. One of your previous guests, Dr. Carrie Mongol, discussed about this a lot with the recent discovery of a new skeleton of Homo habilis, again showing that it was smaller in size and had disproportionately slightly longer arms compared to the rest of the members of the genus Homo, and a little bit more similar to earlier species like Australopithecus. And so it adds to the growing discussion of what do we consider human and what do we consider part of our lineage and our direct lineage in the genus Homo. So there's lots of fascinating implications there.
Well, it's really exciting work that you and your colleagues are doing, and I'm very grateful that you've been able to take the time to come on to the show today. So, what's next for you? What future projects can you tell us about?
Well, thank you very much for having me on. Yeah, there's so many fun projects that I'm still involved with, not just in hominin evolution research, but still I'm working on fun projects on the evolution of dinosaurs. I'm excited to be starting an early career fellowship funded by the Leverhulme Trust later this year. Well, I'll continue studying body size evolution, specifically in all of birds and all of mammals, and how over the last 66 million years, what we call the Cenozoic era, how climate change impacted the evolution of different sized birds and mammals. So very excited for that.
Dr. JACOB GARDNER, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the conversation.